the most incorrupted new God, the most incorrupted new gods, a most incorrupted new God, the most incorrupted new goddess, the most incorrupted new goddesses, a most incorrupted new goddess, the most incorrupted old God, the most incorrupted old gods, a most incorrupted old God, the most incorrupted old goddess, the most incorrupted old goddesses, a most incorrupted old goddess, the most incorrupted greater God, the most incorrupted greater gods, a most incorrupted greater God, the most incorrupted greater goddess, the most incorrupted greater goddesses, a most incorrupted greater goddess, the most incorrupted lesser God, the most incorrupted lesser gods, a most incorrupted lesser God, the most incorrupted lesser goddess, the most incorrupted lesser goddesses, a most incorrupted lesser goddess, the most incorrupted greater spirit, the most incorrupted greater spirits, a most incorrupted greater spirit, the most incorrupted lesser spirit, the most incorrupted lesser spirits, a most incorrupted lesser spirit, the most incorrupted major God, the most incorrupted major gods, a most incorrupted major God, the most incorrupted major goddess, the most incorrupted major goddesses, a most incorrupted major goddess, the most incorrupted minor God, the most incorrupted minor gods, a most incorrupted minor God, the most incorrupted minor goddess, the most incorrupted minor goddesses, a most incorrupted minor goddess, the most incorrupted superior God, the most incorrupted superior gods, a most incorrupted superior God, the most incorrupted superior goddess, the most incorrupted superior goddesses, a most incorrupted superior goddess, the most incorrupted inferior God, the most incorrupted inferior gods, a most incorrupted inferior God, the most incorrupted inferior goddess, the most incorrupted inferior goddesses, a most incorrupted inferior goddess, the most incorrupted ancestor God, the most incorrupted ancestor gods, a most incorrupted ancestor God, the most incorrupted ancestor goddess, the most incorrupted ancestor goddesses, a most incorrupted ancestor goddess, the most incorrupted descendant God, the most incorrupted descendant gods, a most incorrupted descendant God, the most incorrupted descendant goddess, the most incorrupted descendant goddesses, a most incorrupted descendant goddess, the most incorrupted descendant God, the most incorrupted descendant gods, a most incorrupted descendant God, the most incorrupted descendant goddess, the most incorrupted descendant goddesses, a most incorrupted descendant goddess, the most incorrupted transcendent God, the most incorrupted transcendent gods, a most incorrupted transcendent God, the most incorrupted transcendent goddess, the most incorrupted transcendent goddesses, a most incorrupted transcendent goddess, the most incorrupted future God, the most incorrupted future gods, a most incorrupted future God, the most incorrupted future goddess, the most incorrupted future goddesses, a most incorrupted future goddess, the most incorrupted present God, the most incorrupted present gods, a most incorrupted present God, the most incorrupted present goddess, the most incorrupted present goddesses, a most incorrupted present goddess, the most incorrupted past God, the most incorrupted past gods, a most incorrupted past God, the most incorrupted past goddess, the most incorrupted past goddesses, a most incorrupted past goddess, the most incorrupted God, the most incorrupted gods, a most incorrupted God, the most incorrupted goddess, the most incorrupted goddesses, a most incorrupted goddess, the most incorrupted half-God, the most incorrupted half-gods, a most incorrupted half-God, the most incorrupted half-goddess, the most incorrupted half-goddesses, a most incorrupted half-goddess, the most incorrupted vessel, the most incorrupted vessels, a most incorrupted vessel, the most incorrupted person, the most incorrupted persons, a most incorrupted person, the most incorrupted image, the most incorrupted images, a most incorrupted image, the most incorrupted belief, the most incorrupted beliefs, a most incorrupted belief, the most incorrupted thought, the most incorrupted thoughts, a most incorrupted thought, the most incorrupted word, the most incorrupted words, a most incorrupted word, the most incorrupted action, the most incorrupted actions, a most incorrupted action, the most incorrupted situation, the most incorrupted situations, a most incorrupted situation, the most incorrupted circumstance, the most incorrupted circumstances, a most incorrupted circumstance, the most incorrupted relationship, the most incorrupted relationships, a most incorrupted relationship, the most incorrupted number, the most incorrupted numbers, a most incorrupted number, the most incorrupted formula, the most incorrupted formulas, a most incorrupted formula, the most incorrupted symbol, the most incorrupted symbols, a most incorrupted symbol, the most incorrupted color, the most incorrupted colors, a most incorrupted color, the most incorrupted thing, the most incorrupted things, a most incorrupted thing, the most incorrupted way, the most incorrupted ways, a most incorrupted way, the most incorrupted place, the most incorrupted places, a most incorrupted place, the most incorrupted time, the most incorrupted times, a most incorrupted time, the most incorrupted event, the most incorrupted events, a most incorrupted event, the most incorrupted result, the most incorrupted results, a most incorrupted result,